Holiday Fratricide by Ryan Michael McKern. Part 1. The subtle cold, wet drops of water gathered and began to sting upon his forehead amid the winter air, immediately forming soft ice. As he awoke, he struggled to see, surrounded by a haze of white. After a few moments, the icy feeling began to shiver his body into an alert and yet hazy state of thought. He then began to feel his eyes are sore. Nothing but blackness and purple stars fill the disoriented mind. He cannot open his eyes. Panic begins to set in as the pain of his lower half of his body slowly creeps into play. After closing and opening his eyes, the white haze begins to focus into a crystal clarity. Then beyond, in the distance, were white snow-felled trees. Ahead of him was blurry in sight. And then the feeling in his fingers began to shift from a freezing numb sensation back to a stage of normality. The touch of cold metal pressed against him snugly. He realized the pain he was in, letting out a wild shriek of despair and agony, spitting out a cough of blood onto the red vine shrubbery below. He lifts his head to upright position, noticing painfully he can't move the lower half of his waist. With his vision now returning at a faster pace, and a faint high-pitched ring in his ear, he then begins to feel his eyes are sore. Nothing but blackness and the purple stars for the disoriented mind as he cannot open his eyes. Panic begins to set in, as in the pain in the lower half of the body slowly creeps. And at that moment, the large lungs feel the scent of pine trees, forest air, and sounds of running water. He can, at least for a moment, calm his thoughts and nerves as he attempts to get his bearings of the situation, recollecting from a coherent memory of how and why he's arrived at the situation of utter despair. An iron taste washed over his gums, and he spit out blood that was forming underneath his tongue. A sensation of discomfort by his tonsils made it hard to swallow or speak. The thoughts of bruised lungs, ribs, or even more internal damage weighed heavily in his mind. Just one of the many thoughts feeling and rushing through his head and nerves. Daunting is the situation. A slight relief of pressure as it's replaced by the feeling of thirst, dehydration, and dizziness. Attempting to quench his thirst, just too small to feel his thirst, he thought. He tilts his head back and opens his mouth in an attempt to catch the falling snow. A small, stiff pain fell into the back of his neck just then. Within a moment of short breath, the shock begins to subside. And a moment of clarity. "Rosanna," he muttered. Within a moment of short breath, the shock begins to subside. And a moment of clarity. "Rosanna," he muttered. A mouth the short taste of blood that muffled again an attempt to speak. The thoughts had materialized, and soon like a puzzle began to fit. His remorse, his regret. He remembers the love of his life, being with her, conversing and sharing a holiday dinner at home. But what went wrong? "Why am I here?" he sobs, and tries to scream, yet to strain only vocal cords from the car engine leaves him short-breathed and helpless. Within a sudden flash, the car stereo turns on, blaring radio noise. And at that sharp moment, it stops. The shadow begins.